Something is shifting in what cannot be seen, like a subtle disturbance running through the invisible thread that ties you to the person who still lingers in your thoughts when everything else goes quiet. The one whose absence did not simply create distance, but a strange emptiness inside you that distraction never fully manages to cover. You can feel it, even if you cannot explain it. That unusual pressure in your chest, that quick response in your body when they cross your mind. It feels as if something is building, as if reality itself is pausing before it changes direction. What has been stuck is no longer meant to stay stuck. What has been silent is beginning to move toward expression. What was frozen by fear, pride, and avoidance is starting to fracture, slowly but inevitably, like ice giving way under rising warmth. Deep in the layers of the mind, in what Carl Jung described as the collective unconscious, there are signals that do not arrive in direct words, but in patterns. Repeating numbers that catch your attention too often to ignore. Dreams that feel heavier than imagination and stay with you after waking. Unexpected reminders through music or moments that seem too precisely timed to be random. These experiences begin to feel connected, as if something larger is communicating through them. This is what many would call coincidence, but it feels different now. It feels coordinated, as if life itself is reflecting an inner shift that is already underway. A form of synchronicity that suggests the connection you feel has not faded, only entered a deeper phase of transformation. Something is also unfolding on their side, even if they do not fully understand it yet. Their conscious mind may still try to maintain control, still try to stay distant or composed, but beneath that surface something is loosening. Resistance is no longer as stable as it once was. What they buried is beginning to rise again. It is like emotional pressure building quietly over time, forming weight in places they thought were sealed. The kind of internal tension that does not stay hidden forever. The air around this connection feels charged, as if change is no longer a possibility, but an approaching certainty. You have been standing in that in-between space, between what ended and what has not yet begun again. And that space is starting to close. The structures they built inside themselves are no longer as solid as they once appeared. Small cracks are forming in what once felt unbreakable, and those cracks are beginning to spread. There is a growing conflict within them, a silent struggle between the part that wants to protect itself and the part that cannot deny what it feels anymore. Between emotional defense and emotional truth. Between learned avoidance and something more honest that refuses to stay buried. They are reaching a point where pretending feels heavier than truth, where acting unaffected takes more effort than they can sustain. And in the quietest hours, when everything outside is still, thoughts of you return without permission. Not as memories they choose, but as presence they cannot fully shut out. The mind tries to rationalize it, but the body reacts differently. The heart remembers what the ego tries to forget. And slowly, the idea of distance begins to feel less like safety and more like loss. This shift does not happen all at once. It unfolds in stages. First, the quiet realization that you occupy their thoughts far more than expected. Then, the uncomfortable awareness that others no longer compare favorably, no matter how hard they try to move forward. Then the deeper recognition that life without you, even if functional on the surface, feels emotionally incomplete. And now comes the breaking point, where the question is no longer about pride or fear, but about consequence. What matters more, holding on to emotional control or risking everything for something real? They are beginning to understand that what existed between you was not ordinary. It was not easily replaceable. It left an imprint that does not fade just because it is ignored. It lingers, reshaping how everything else is experienced. Every defense they built to keep you at a distance now demands more energy than they can afford. Every attempt to move on feels partially incomplete, and what they once called strength now feels like exhaustion. There is a moment approaching where avoidance stops being possible, where the internal conflict reaches its limit and something has to give, not dramatically, but inevitably, like a decision that has been delayed too long finally making itself. They are starting to imagine what it would mean to reach out, not casually, not indirectly, but honestly, not through small signals or distant gestures, but through something that exposes what they truly feel. And that thought alone brings both fear and relief. Fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of what happens if the truth is not received the way they hope, but also relief, because continuing to suppress it has become its own form of suffering. They begin rehearsing what cannot be easily said, trying to find language for something that was never expressed properly, weighing silence against honesty and slowly realizing that silence has already cost them enough. At some point, the fear of losing you completely becomes stronger than the fear of being seen, and that shift changes everything internally. It is no longer about maintaining image or control. It becomes about not living with regret. Something external may have triggered this change recently, a moment, a sign, or simply the realization that you are no longer emotionally standing still, that you are moving forward, healing, becoming someone new, and that realization hits harder than expected. Because as long as they believed you were waiting, they could delay their own truth. But seeing you step forward breaks that illusion. It forces them to confront the reality that time is not paused, and connection does not remain suspended forever. You are not who you were when they left you, and that truth disrupts everything they assumed. It creates urgency where there was once delay. It replaces comfort with uncertainty. Now the fear of losing you fully becomes heavier than the fear of opening up. And in that imbalance, something irreversible begins to form inside them, a decision that can no longer stay unmade. And this shift in the internal balance of power has done something irreversible. It has turned what once felt impossible into something that now feels unavoidable. They have reached a point of emotional collapse where the weight of your absence became heavier than anything they could continue to carry. Every coping strategy they relied on stopped working. Every distraction lost its effect. Every attempt to outrun the feeling eventually failed. And in that quiet aftermath, they were left alone with a truth they could no longer avoid, that choosing fear over love may have been the most costly decision of their life. What people often call divine timing is not about waiting until comfort arrives. Comfort rarely comes before the leap. It arrives at the moment when inner pressure becomes stronger than hesitation, when the emotional pull toward truth overrides every logical argument for staying guarded. The need to remain safe starts to lose its authority. At that point, even past wounds begin to lose their power to dictate the future. Old fears still speak, but they no longer lead. The desire for connection starts to outweigh the instinct for protection, and something inside them begins to move in a direction they have avoided for a long time. This is the stage where inner transformation can no longer be postponed. They are being pulled into a deeper psychological confrontation with themselves, one that Carl Jung described through the idea of the shadow, the hidden parts of the psyche that contain everything a person rejects, denies, or refuses to integrate. Until those parts are faced, the same emotional patterns tend to repeat in different forms, especially in relationships. And so, in your absence, they have been forced inward. Not by choice, but by emotional necessity. They had to confront the origins of their reactions, the early imprints that shaped how they respond to closeness, conflict, and vulnerability. The old emotional lessons that taught them to associate intimacy with risk or attachment with loss. The protective strategies they built to survive emotional discomfort are now the very things they are questioning. This is not a comfortable process. It rarely is. It happens in private moments of honesty that no one else sees. In the quiet realization that the distance they created did not protect them from pain, it only delayed it. They begin to see how much of what they projected outward was actually unresolved within them. How much of the withdrawal, the hesitation, the inconsistency was not about you, but about internal conflict they had never fully addressed. And slowly, accountability starts to replace denial. There is a painful clarity that emerges when someone realizes that what they were running from was not the relationship itself, but the intensity of what it awakened inside them. In that process, they are no longer just remembering you, they are re-evaluating themselves. Every defense mechanism they once trusted begins to feel insufficient. Every excuse begins to sound incomplete. And in that inner confrontation, something begins to shift, not suddenly, but undeniably. The idea that love requires vulnerability stops being an abstract concept and becomes a lived reality they can no longer avoid. The realization settles in that no meaningful connection can survive if it is constantly protected from emotional risk. They start to see how deeply past experiences shaped their present behavior, how earlier disappointments influenced current fears, how patterns formed long before you entered the picture continue to echo through their choices, and, more importantly, how those patterns may have interfered with something real when it finally appeared. This is the beginning of integration, the process of bringing awareness to what was previously unconscious. Not erasing the past, but understanding it in a way that prevents repetition. In that space of reflection, they begin to recognize that the version of themselves that pulled away from you was not the most truthful version. It was a defended one, a guarded one, a version shaped more by fear than by clarity. And now something different is emerging. There is a growing awareness that healing is not about becoming someone entirely new, but about becoming honest enough to stop repeating what caused pain in the first place. That awareness changes everything internally, even if nothing has been expressed outwardly yet. This is why the silence no longer feels neutral to them. It feels loaded, it feels active. It feels like a mirror they cannot avoid looking into. And within that mirror, they begin to see you differently too, not as a memory they can casually set aside, but as a presence that altered something fundamental in their emotional landscape, something that did not fade with distance. That recognition creates tension, because it forces them to reconcile who they were with who they are becoming. At this stage, avoidance starts to feel heavier than honesty. Emotional distance starts to feel more exhausting than emotional risk. And the idea of reaching out, once delayed and postponed, begins to form in their mind with increasing clarity. Not as impulse, but as inevitability. They begin to imagine what it would mean to speak openly, to remove the layers of control and carefully constructed distance, to stop managing perception and start telling the truth as it is, not as it was filtered through fear. And with that thought comes both fear and relief. Fear of rejection, fear of exposure, fear of being too late, but also relief, the possibility that truth, even if vulnerable, might finally end the internal conflict they have been living with. What they are approaching is not a small gesture. It is not symbolic or casual. It is something that carries emotional consequence, something that requires stepping out of the identity that once relied on distance for safety. Because pride, once a shield, begins to feel like a barrier to their own emotional truth. And in that shift, something important becomes clear. The person who once walked away is not the same person standing in this realization now. What is forming inside them is a willingness to risk being seen without defenses, a willingness to acknowledge what was lost, what was felt, and what was never fully expressed, not because certainty guarantees a positive outcome, but because silence has already proven too costly. And when someone reaches that point, the internal debate is no longer between love and logic. It becomes between truth and avoidance. And truth, once fully faced, rarely allows a person to remain where they were before. They are standing in a contradiction, afraid and courageous at the same time, unsure yet still moving forward. What is happening inside them is not simple clarity, but a collision between fear and conviction. And still, they are choosing to act. But real change is never proven in moments of emotional intensity. It is not defined by what someone says when they feel overwhelmed, inspired, or desperate. Words can rise quickly and disappear just as fast. Real transformation reveals itself only through what remains after the emotion settles. That is why what comes after the return matters more than the return itself. You will recognize authenticity not through promises but through patterns, through consistency, through time, through whether their actions begin to match the direction of their words long after the initial emotional wave has passed. And this is where discernment becomes essential. The psychological dynamic that Carl Jung explored in his work around projection and the unconscious becomes relevant here, the idea that we often see in others what is still unresolved within ourselves. This is why clarity cannot come from emotion alone. It comes from observation, repetition, and lived behavior over time. If someone has truly shifted, it becomes visible in how they carry themselves. There is less volatility, less confusion projected outward, less need to defend or escape. Instead, there is steadiness, accountability, a willingness to remain present even when discomfort arises. They do not rush your healing. They do not demand immediate trust. They understand that trust is not spoken into existence. It is built slowly through reliability that holds up under pressure. You will also notice whether they have taken ownership of their internal world or whether they are still externalizing it, whether they are still blaming circumstances, timing, or other people for patterns that originate within them, whether they are still unconsciously expecting you to resolve what only self-awareness can heal. Real inner work always shows itself in specificity, in the ability to speak clearly about patterns, choices, and consequences without hiding behind vague language or emotional performance. When insight is real, it is grounded. It does not need to convince. It simply exists through behavior. But just as important as recognizing change in them is recognizing clarity in yourself. You are not required to accept any return simply because it is offered. You are not obligated to re-enter something that once caused harm, even if emotions still exist. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to question. You are allowed to require evidence of change that unfolds over time rather than in a single moment of intensity. And you are also allowed to walk away completely if that truth becomes clear within you. Both decisions carry validity. Both can be aligned with self-respect, depending on what your inner clarity reveals. There is no universal rule here, only awareness of what strengthens you and what diminishes you. The empowerment you gained through distance is not something that disappears when someone returns. It remains part of you. The boundaries you formed, the insight you developed, the emotional strength you built, none of that is undone unless you choose to abandon it. At the same time, openness is not weakness. If someone truly demonstrates sustained change, if their presence consistently reflects growth rather than repetition of old patterns, then softening does not mean losing yourself. It means choosing consciously rather than reacting from fear. Forgiveness, when it is real, is not denial. It is not forgetting. It is not bypassing pain. It is releasing the grip that the past has over your present state so that your future is not dictated by old injury. What matters most is not controlling what they do, but staying connected to what you know is true for you, your body's sense of ease or tension, your intuition's quiet signals, your emotional stability in their presence over time. That is where clarity lives, not in speculation, but in lived experience. And whatever unfolds next, the center of your power remains unchanged. You are not waiting in a powerless position. You are not incomplete until a certain outcome arrives. You are already whole, already capable of choosing, already grounded in your own direction. Nothing outside of you is responsible for finishing what is already intact within you. What comes and goes may influence your experience, but it does not define your foundation. What is approaching is not distant or abstract anymore. It feels closer because something is indeed shifting into motion. Internal resistance is changing form. Emotional distance is no longer static. Something is beginning to move toward expression, not because it was forced, but because time and awareness have started to dissolve what was once unspoken. The silence that once felt like distance now carries information. The absence that once felt confusing now starts to reveal pattern, and patterns, once seen clearly, begin to lose their power to mislead. But what it becomes depends on what is sustained, not what is initiated. Many things can begin with intensity, emotion, or impulse, but very few are shaped correctly by that same energy alone. What survives is what continues when novelty fades, when emotional spikes settle, when attention is no longer carried by excitement but by consistency. This is where truth begins to separate itself from projection. This is where intention is tested by behavior, not words. Pay attention to consistency over intensity, to stability over declarations, to behavior over language, because language can be shaped in moments, adjusted in emotion, and influenced by circumstance. But behavior reveals pattern, and pattern reveals truth. It is not what is said when emotion is high that matters most, but what remains when emotion returns to neutrality. That is where reality lives, in the ordinary repetition of how someone shows up when nothing is being demanded from them. Because alignment is always revealed over time, never in a single moment. A single moment can inspire hope, create attachment, or trigger interpretation, but time removes distortion. Time strips away performance. Time exposes what is natural versus what is constructed. And in that gradual unveiling, what is real becomes steady, while what is not real becomes inconsistent, confusing, or unsustainable. And as this unfolds, your role is not to chase certainty, but to remain anchored in your own clarity, able to receive what is real and equally able to release what is not. Chasing certainty often comes from discomfort with not knowing, but clarity does not require immediate answers. It requires the ability to observe without distortion, to notice without needing to intervene, to allow reality to show itself fully before assigning meaning to it. There is a difference between being open and being ungrounded. Openness allows experience to reveal itself. Ungroundedness tries to fill gaps too quickly, often with assumptions or emotional urgency. When you remain anchored, you do not lose sensitivity, you gain accuracy. You begin to see patterns as they are, not as fear or hope tries to shape them into being. The next chapter is not defined by urgency or fear. It is defined by awareness. And awareness changes the entire structure of experience. What once felt like uncertainty becomes observation, what once felt like emotional turbulence becomes information, and what once felt personal becomes understandable through pattern recognition rather than emotional reaction. In that state of awareness, you no longer interpret every shift as a signal that requires immediate response. Instead, you allow time to complete its work. You let consistency speak louder than isolated moments. You stop trying to extract meaning from fragments, and instead you watch the full picture form on its own. Because from this awareness, whatever enters your life next will show you exactly where things stand, without illusion, without confusion, and without needing to force meaning onto what is already becoming visible on its own. And when something is real, it does not require constant decoding. It does not rely on emotional guessing. It becomes understandable through its steadiness. And when something is not aligned, it will also reveal itself, not through dramatic endings, but through subtle inconsistency, through distance that does not resolve, through effort that does not match words, through patterns that repeat without growth. You will not need to overthink it. You will simply see it. This is where emotional maturity changes everything. Not because life becomes easier, but because your relationship with uncertainty becomes clearer. You no longer try to control every outcome in order to feel safe. Instead, you trust your ability to respond to whatever is revealed. That trust becomes your stability. And in that stability, there is no urgency to prove, fix, or hold on to what cannot remain naturally. There is only presence, observation, discernment, and the quiet understanding that what is meant to align with you will not require distortion to stay. So whatever unfolds next, you do not meet it from desperation or doubt. You meet it from clarity. And in that clarity, everything either strengthens its place in your life or naturally falls away without resistance.